My name is Amy Sands, and I am a retired staff and administrator from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. That was my most recent job about 4 or 5 years ago. But for the last, I'd say, 30 to 35 years, I've been really a researcher and policy activist in the area of nonproliferation and disarmament and arms control. Nonproliferation, arms control, disarmament. Mm-hmm. I've done some work, and my PhD thesis was on terrorism, so I do have some background in that. My best expertise was what I developed when I worked at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, where I was responsible for looking at what was then called the rest of the world. That meant everything but the Soviet Union and China. And we had to really understand the nuclear and eventually missile programs of countries like Iran, Iraq, India, Pakistan. So I got a very good insight into how some countries that aren't necessarily direct threats to a country like the United States, but do play a role in this world of nonproliferation, are going about trying to achieve their security concerns and some of the challenges in trying to deter them from doing that. Mm-hmm. I'd be glad to talk about the strategic issues and some of the historical concerns. And the other area that I have expertise in is probably what's called intelligence analysis. Mm-hmm. For almost 12 years, that's what I did at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory as a support to the Department of Energy in the United States. And then I worked in the Clinton administration in a high-level position in the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, trying to help develop verification and compliance protocols and regimes, which meant you had to understand the intelligence. So my strength is probably intelligence analysis, and that's what I have given talks on, given a course on. So I'd be glad to give a lecture on that. Well, I have to admit, honestly, that I didn't sort of from the first day I went to graduate school have a passion for nonproliferation and intelligence. About my third job out from finishing my PhD, I ended up at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory because it seemed like a great fit for my own background, and it was. And that's where I really got myself onto a career path that ended up with all the opportunities I had to play a role and do interesting research in this field of arms control and nonproliferation. Well, for the most part, I had gone to graduate school at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and thought I would end up in Washington, probably in didn't follow that path at all. So what I thought I was going to do turned out to be slightly different, but probably ended up about the same in the end. Basically, my path was, once I had the ability to take a job anywhere in the country, because personally, my situation with my marriage changed. And so I had the freedom to look around the country to see where I might want to take a job. I ended up at the job in California at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in a program called Z Division that was, as I noted earlier, an intelligence program and research think tank, basically, for the Department of Energy in this area of nonproliferation. And I basically, after working there 11, 12 years, had the opportunity to go to Washington to be in the administration of the Clinton administration. And they had just revitalized the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and I was one of the senior officials in that organization for about 2 years. And when I decided I had done my time in Washington and was ready to return to a more normal life, I ended up coming back to the Center for Nonproliferation Studies at what was then the Monterey Institute of International Studies. And that's sort of where I spent my next 20 years. I was 7 years the deputy of that center. It's a research center that focuses on nonproliferation and disarmament issues. And I also taught in the programs at the graduate school. Eventually, I became the dean of one of the graduate schools. And then after that, I became the provost of the whole institute and was involved with the merger that happened with Middlebury Institute. about, I'd say about 13 years into my career at the Institute, that all happened. So, once I came back to California, I sort of settled into having one location in Monterey, but it gave me the flexibility to teach, to do research, to help manage a program. I was on several advisory boards for different national labs at Livermore, at Sandia, at Pacific Northwest, at Argonne. I was ended up on some study commissions for the National Academy of Sciences, and twice I was on the International Advisory Board for the State Department. The Undersecretary of Security it's the Secretary of State has a advisory board, but it's run by an undersecretary for them. So I've had a good example of somebody who sort of got a great job and that set them on a path. And I became passionate of that and very committed to that field. And I've, had wonderful experiences. I hopefully have, provided some contribution to my field, and sort of ready to help others follow in my footsteps, as they say. Oh, it's an interesting problem to get the public to care, because until a horrendous event happens, or somehow there's a strong reminder of what happened in World War II at the end with the explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there's doesn't seem to be an easy way to get the public to pay attention to this. But the downside of having nuclear weapons in different countries' arsenals, including the United States, is the horrendous catastrophe that could result from their possibly being used, even small ones. And as we've all now lived through with the Ukraine crisis, we've seen the threatening and sort of rattling of the nuclear possible option by the Russians. That really is disturbing, because I do think most of us in the field are concerned that once these weapons are used, even if it seems to be on a small scale way, which is pretty hard to limit it that way, that the floodgates are sort of open to countries wanting them and trying to figure out how to really integrate them. And they are really weapons that can cause just horrendous problems, both for the populations involved, but for the environment. And, we already have enough troubles on all those levels. We don't have to add to it. So this is a weapon that needs to, sort of stay unused at this point. And the public, I've thought about how do you get a public interested, and I think some of the efforts of N Squared, for example, are just wonderful, because they're trying to create a media presence for it in a different way than when I was coming through the ranks, where it was sort of academics and policymakers thinking about it. We need to get the public to get revitalized about this topic of preventing the use of these weapons and disarmament in general. Climate change and the lack of the ability of the world to really address it in a way. But what that all goes back to, I think, is the lack of a sense of community in the world to address the looming challenges the Earth has, basically. And whether it's climate change, or whether it's aggression by a country like Russia in various countries, or whether it's the lack of compliance with arms control, there just isn't a willingness across the globe, and including the United States, NATO, the different treaties that I know about, to really hold countries accountable and individuals accountable for some of the problems they're creating, the threats they make, the disasters they cause. And it's, I think, causing the world to be on a pretty disastrous path at the moment.